Prologue echoes across the depths. The sea remembered everything. In the crushing dark where Uchelon sat on his throne of living coral, the currents carried whispers from every corner of existence. Stories that had been told. Stories that had been unwritten. Stories that had never been, but might yet become. The library of the third story had grown in the months since its founding. Hundreds of spirits now gathered in its glowing shelves, former endings learning to be doors, unwritten finding their voices, whisperfolk swimming through its corridors with songs of ancient memory. But tonight, the currents carried something else. Uchelon felt it first, a tremor in the web of connection, a thread being plucked far across the narrative field. He closed his eyes and reached out with the perception he had been practicing for so long, tracing the disturbance to its source. What he found made his ancient heart beat faster. "Something wakes," he said to the assembled spirits. "Something old. Something that was sealed away long before the fracture, before the UR tale, before even the first storyteller put pen to page." "What is it?" asked the tragedy of the hero's death, now transformed into a spirit of continuation. Uchelon's eyes, once voids of pure ending, now warm with the light of new beginnings, flickered with something that might have been fear. The ones who were forgotten before forgetting existed. The ones who came before the first story. The ones we thought were myths. He paused. The Threadborn. Chapter 1, The Spindle in the Deep. 3 days earlier, in the Whisperfolk city beneath the Twilight Sea, a discovery had been made. The Whisperfolk were builders of organic wonder, coral spice, nacre bridges, chambers lit by bioluminescent pearls. But beneath their city, deeper than they had ever excavated, something else lay buried. Something that was not organic. Something that was not made by any race known to the fractured world. A spindle. It rose from the seafloor like a needle thrust into the heart of existence, tall as a tower, smooth as glass, pulsing with a light that was neither the warm glow of continuation nor the cold fire of ending. It was the light of something older. Something that predated both. She who heard the first silence stood before the spindle, her silver down rippling with an emotion her people had not felt in millennia. Terror. "We did not build this," she said. "We did not even know it was here. It has been buried since before we came to these waters. Since before the fracture. Since before the UR tale." "Then who built it?" asked the Rain, who had been summoned from the surface with Landra and Aria. The mat on his arm was blazing with light he had never seen before, not the gentle glow of connections, but something sharper. Something urgent. "The Threadborn," the Whisperfolk leader said. "We thought they were legend. Stories that the first storyteller told to their children, tales of beings who could weave reality itself. But the legends say they vanished before the UR tale was written. Erased themselves from existence to make room for the stories to come. And now they're back." Landra asked. "Not back. Waking. The completion of the cycle, the first story, the second story, the third story, it has stirred something. The Threadborn sealed themselves away because the cycle was incomplete. Now that it is complete, they're coming back," the Run finished. Aria, now 2.5 years old, pressed her small hand against the spindle. The light within it fled, and for a moment, everyone present saw something, a vision, a memory, a possibility. A vast loom stretching across the void between worlds. Figures made of pure thread, their bodies woven from narratives that had never been spoken. A song that was not sound but structure, the framework of reality being stitched together by hands that had existed before time. And a voice, ancient and tired and hopeful all at once. "The cycle is complete. The door is open. We return." Chapter 2: The Council of the Forgotten. The Provisional Congress convened in emergency session, not in their usual chamber, but in the drowned library itself, now transformed into the library of the third story. The shelves glowed with the light of narratives that had chosen continuation. The water was warm and welcoming. Uchelon sat on his coral throne, surrounded by the spirits of his school. But the atmosphere was tense. The spindle is not the only one, she who heard the first silence reported. Our scouts have found 6 more, buried in the margins between drafts. They are rising. Slowly, but they are rising. Rising to what purpose? Seraphina asked. The 4,000 first glyph pulsed in her chest, responding to a disturbance she could not name. To recall the Threadborn. The spindles are anchors, points where the Threadborn tied themselves to reality before they vanished. If all 7 rise, the Threadborn will return fully. And if they return? Dominic asked. The Whisperfolk leader was silent for a long moment. The legends say the Threadborn were the weavers of the first reality. They created the framework upon which the tale was written. They were not gods, they were something older. Something more fundamental. They were the possibility of story, before story existed. And when they vanished, they left the tale behind. They believed that mortal beings, storytellers, should be the ones to fill the framework with narratives. They erased themselves so that others could create. That sounds noble, Helena said. It was. But the legends also say that not all Threadborn agreed with this decision. Some believed that mortals were too flawed, too chaotic, too likely to fracture the perfect framework they had woven. Those Threadborn did not erase themselves. They were sealed, imprisoned by their kin in the deepest margins, bound to the incomplete cycle. And now the cycle is complete, Karis said. The seal is breaking. Yes. And the Threadborn who return may not be the ones who chose to leave. They may be the ones who were forced. A heavy silence fell over the assembly. The Wren looked at Aria, who was sitting on the floor tracing patterns in the water, maps of connections that only she could see. Her face was calm, but her hands were moving faster than usual. What do they want? The Wren asked. Unknown, the Echo Queen said. She had been silent until now, her blind eyes distant, her perception stretched across the infinite futures. But I have seen glimpses. The Threadborn who were sealed, they called themselves the Severed. They believed that the tale was a mistake. That mortal stories were corruptions of the perfect framework. That the only way to restore true order was to unmake everything that had been written since the first storyteller put pen to page. Unmake everything, Landra said. Including us. Especially us, the Echo Queen confirmed. The Severed have been waiting for the cycle to complete. They have been waiting for the door to open. And now it's open, the Wren said. Chapter 3: The Severed Awaken. The first Severed emerged from a spindle in the Obsidian Wastes, a desolate region of the Shadow Draft where stories went to die. It rose from the glassy surface like a figure stepping out of a mirror, its body woven from threads of pure narrative termination. It had no face, only a pattern of interlocking spirals where its features should have been. It stood in the wasteland for a long moment, feeling the currents of the fractured world for the first time in uncountable millennia. It felt the third trunk spreading its roots. It felt the library of the third story pulsing with continuation. It felt the tale, completed but not restored, balanced with the stories that had been written since. And it felt disgust. Corruption, it said, and its voice was the sound of a story being erased. The mortals have corrupted the framework. The cycle was not meant to be completed. It was meant to be closed. Other severed were emerging now, from spindles in the depths, in the mountains, in the spaces between drafts. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Their bodies were woven from different kinds of thread, some from endings, some from beginnings, some from the spaces between words where meaning lurked unseen. They gathered in the Obsidian Wastes, their spiraling faces turned toward the distant glow of the World Tree. The UR tale was meant to be the only story, the first severed said. The framework was meant to be perfect. The mortals were meant to be contained. But they fractured the UR tale. They created chaos. They wrote stories that should never have been written. We can unmake it, another severed said, this one woven from the threads of forgotten tragedies. The cycle is complete. The door is open. We can unmake everything they have written and restore the perfect framework. And the mortals? They are corruptions. They will be unwritten. The framework will be purified. The severed turned their spiraling faces toward the World Tree. They began to move. Chapter 4, The Messenger from Before. The Ray was in the garden of the Provisional Congress, watching Aria draw maps in the dirt, when the messenger arrived. It was not a whisper folk. It was not a spirit. It was not any being he had ever seen before. It was woven from threads, thousands of them, fine as spider silk, shimmering with colors that did not exist in either draft. It had no face, only a pattern of interlocking spirals. But its voice, when it spoke, was gentle. Do not fear me, it said. I am not severed. I am what remains of the Threadborn who chose to leave. I am the last of the weavers. The Wren had drawn his sword, a reflex he had developed since the grey tide, but Aria had looked up from her maps and smiled. Hello, she said. You're the one who waited. The Threadborn, the weaver, inclined its head. You can see me, little mapmaker. You can see the threads that bind me to the world. You are the child of continuation. The one who completed the cycle. You know about her? Landra asked, her voice sharp with protective instinct. I know about all of you. I have been watching since the first storyteller died. I have been waiting for someone to complete the cycle, not to close it, but to open it. The severed want to unmake everything. I want to save it. Why should we trust you? The Rin asked. Because I am the one who sealed the severed away. I am the one who convinced the other Threadborn to erase themselves so that mortal stories could flourish. I am the reason the fractured world exists at all. The weaver paused. And I am dying. The seal that held the severed was tied to my existence. Now that the cycle is complete, the seal is breaking, and I am unraveling. I have days, perhaps hours, before I become nothing. But before I go, I can help you stop them. How? Seraphina asked. She had arrived with the others, drawn by the pearls of the weaver's presence. The severed are powerful, but they are not invincible. They are woven from the threads of the perfect framework, the UR tale as it was before it fractured. But the UR tale has changed. It has been completed. The second story and the third story have added new threads to the framework, threads the severed cannot perceive, because they predate the severed's sealing. What kind of threads? Caris asked. The weaver turned its spiraling face toward Aria. The threads she draws. The maps she makes. The connections she sees between all stories, written and unwritten. She is the only one who can perceive the full framework, the UR tale, the second story, the third story, and all the infinite possibilities that lie beyond. If she can weave those threads into a new pattern, she can create a seal that the severed cannot break. Aria, Landra said. She's 2.5 years old. She can barely write her own name. She does not need to write. She needs to weave. The same way she wove the first unwritten into existence. The same way she completed the Ua tale. She has been weaving since before she was born. She simply needs to do it consciously, one time, for the fate of the world. The Wren looked at his daughter. Aria looked back at him with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. Map, she said. Weave. Continue. Chapter 5, The Return of the Prince of Ashes. While the Congress prepared for the Severed's advance, another return was taking place far across the Obsidian Wastes. In the ruins of a fortress that had been abandoned since the Great Fracture, a figure stood beneath a cairn of black stone. The stones cracked. The ground trembled. And a hand, pale as ash, marked with spiraling runes, reached toward the sky. Serathor Veltharn, the Prince of Ashes, opened his eyes for the first time in 3,000 years. He had been sealed here at the end of the Fracture Wars, when the draft split and the old order crumbled. He had been a champion of the Prime Draft, a warrior whose flames could burn stories into existence or erase them entirely. But he had also been a traitor, a prince who had tried to seize the Ua tale for himself, to rewrite the framework according to his own design. His punishment had been eternal imprisonment, bound beneath the Obsidian Wastes by the combined power of both drafts. But the cycle's completion had weakened the old seals, not just the Severed's prison, but all seals. All bindings. All endings that had been forced rather than chosen. Serathor stood in the ruins of his prison and breathed the air of a world that had changed beyond recognition. The cycle is complete, he said, and his voice was the crackle of embers. The Ua tale has been transformed. And I. He raised his hand. Flames spiraled around his fingers, not the flames of destruction, but the flames of creation. The fire that could write stories into being. I am free. He looked toward the distant glow of the world tree, feeling the pulse of the Severed's advance. He felt the weaver's presence, faint and fading. He felt the child of continuation drawing maps in the dirt. And he smiled, a smile that was not cruel, not kind, but something in between. The smile of a prince who had waited 3,000 years for a second chance. The Threadborn are returning, he said. The Severed want to unmake everything. And the little mapmaker needs an army. He began to walk toward the world tree, flames trailing behind him like a cloak of embers. It's time to see if the Prince of Ashes can be something other than a villain. Chapter 6, The Ember Matron's Prophecy. Serathor's return did not go unnoticed. In Aethoria, the city of embers and molten glass, the Ember Matron sat before the eternal hearth and watched the flames dance. She was the oldest living being in the Prime Draft, older than the Whisper Folk, older than the Fracture, older than almost everything except the Threadborn themselves. She had been a child when the Ua tale was written. She had been a young woman when the Fracture split the world. She had been ancient when Serathor was sealed away. And now she felt him waking. The Prince of Ashes returns, she said, and her voice was the crackle of burning cedar. The cycle completes. The Severed rise. And the child of continuation draws maps in the dirt. Before her, kneeling in the ember light, was Uchelon Veltharn, Duchess of Ash, direct descendant of Serathor's bloodline, and keeper of the flame that had been passed down through 3,000 years of waiting. What do we do, matron? Uchelon asked. We fulfill the prophecy. The one that was written at the moment of Serathor's sealing. The one that has been passed down through our house for 3 millennia. The prophecy of the phoenix and the map. Yes. When the cycle completes and the Severed rise, the Prince of Ashes shall walk again. He will seek the child who draws the threads of the world. And together, they will either save existence or burn it to ash. That's not very specific, Evangeline observed. Prophecies never are. The Amber Matron rose from her seat by the hearth. Her body was wreathed in flames that did not burn her, flames that had been burning for so long that they had become part of her flesh, part of her soul, part of the story she had been telling for 3,000 years. Summon the Ash Guard, she commanded. Ready the Amber Fleet. We sail for the World Tree. The Prince of Ashes will need his house. And the Child of Continuation will need all the allies she can gather. What if Serathor has not changed? What if he is still the traitor who tried to seize the Ua tail? The Amber Matron turned her ancient eyes toward the distant pulse of the Severed's advance. Then we deal with that when the time comes. But first, we deal with the Threadborn who want to unmake everything. One apocalypse at a time. Chapter 7, The Gathering of Flames. They gathered from across the fractured world. From the sea came the Whisper Folk, their silver down shimmering with ancient knowledge, their songs carrying the memories of every story they had ever heard. She who heard the first silence led them, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the rising spindles. From the depths came Uchelon and his school of former endings, hundreds of spirits who had once been conclusions, now transformed into doors. The god who had been the ending of all things walked on lakes of flowing water, his coral throne left behind, his map pulsing with the light of connection. From the sky-cleft reaches came Kalin Dracoi and his concept WYRM, the dragon's crystalline scales blazing with the fire of pure logic. Beside them flew Lyra, no longer a princess but something harder to define, a woman who had learned to argue instead of control, and who was ready to argue with the Severed themselves. From the triads of Benantas came Dominic and Damien, their soldiers marching in formation, their dragon seal blazing with ancestral fire. The Knight of Red Knives was gone, dissolved into fragments of light, but his legacy remained, the knowledge that even endings could choose to transform. From the Provisional Congress came Seraphina, Caris, the Echo Queen, Jasmine and Choros, Silas, Helena and Arthur. The core group who had ventured into the drowned library and emerged changed. The ones who had faced Uchelon and the First Page and the Grey Tide and survived. And at the center of it all, in the garden of the Provisional Congress, Aria drew maps in the dirt. She was 2.5 years old. She could name colors and animals and the people who came to visit her. She could trace the connections between all stories, written and unwritten, past and future, real and possible. And now, with the weaver's guidance, she was learning to weave. Tread, she said, her small fingers tracing a line of golden light in the air. Tread. 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 Each word was a connection. Each line was a bond. She was not writing a story, she was writing the possibility of a story. The framework for a seal that would bind the Severed without destroying them. She's doing it, the weaver said. Its form was fading now, unraveling thread by thread. She's weaving the new seal. But it won't be ready before the Severed arrive. You need to buy her time. How much time? The Rain asked. I don't know. Hours. Days. As much as you can give her. The Rain looked at the assembled army, mortals and spirits, endings and beginnings, the transformed and the transforming. All of them united by a single purpose. We'll give her all the time we have, he said. Chapter 8, The Severed Advance. The Severed came across the Obsidian Wastes like a tide of unraveling. They did not march, they wove. Their bodies were threads of pure narrative termination, and as they moved, they stitched themselves through the fabric of reality, unmaking everything in their path. Stories that had been told for generations dissolved into nothing. Landscapes that had existed since the fracture were erased. Characters who had lived and loved and died were unwritten, their names forgotten, their memories scattered like ash. And they were heading for the World Tree. "We can't let them reach Echohold," Dominic said. He stood at the head of the Benanta's forces, his dragon seal blazing. "If they touch the tree, they can unmake the third trunk. The new framework. Everything we've built. Then we stop them here," Uchelon said. The former god of endings had taken a position at the front of the allied army, his map pulsing with the light of every story he had ever consumed, and every story he had since helped to continue. "We hold the line. We give the child time." "You've changed," Dominic observed. "I've been practicing." The Severed reached the edge of the Obsidian Wastes. Their spiraling faces turned toward the allied army, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the first Severed spoke. "You are corruptions. Fragments of a story that should never have been told. You will be unwritten. The framework will be purified." "Come and try," Dominic said. The battle began. Chapter 9, The Battle of the Obsidian Age. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. The Severed did not fight with swords or spears or flames. They fought with unmaking. Each strike of their thread-woven limbs erased whatever they touched, not killing, not destroying, but removing. Soldiers who were hit simply ceased to exist, their stories unwritten, their memories vanishing from the minds of everyone who had known them. But the Allied army had faced unmaking before. They had faced the Grey Tide. They had faced the Night of Red Knives. They had faced the logic of ending itself. And they had learned that unmaking was not the same as victory. Uchelon stepped forward, his map blazing. "You are endings that were forced. Endings that were not chosen. But in the new framework, endings are not inevitable. They are not absolute. They are doors." He reached out with his power, not the power of consumption, but the power of connection. The threads that bound the Severed to their purpose began to loosen. "What are you doing?" the lead Severed demanded. "Offering you a choice. The same choice I was offered. Transformation. Continuation. The chance to become something other than what you were. We do not want transformation. We want purification. Then you will have to go through us." The battle raged on. Dominic and Damien fought back to back, their blades cutting through the threads of the Severed, disrupting their forms long enough for Uchelon's power to offer them transformation. Some Severed refused, and were destroyed. Some hesitated, and were changed. Some accepted, and became something new. But there were too many. The Severed kept coming, an endless tide of unraveling, and the Allied army was being pushed back toward the World Tree. "We can't hold them much longer," Karis shouted. The black flame on his fingertip was blazing, but it was growing smaller with every Severed he pruned. "Just a little longer," Seraphina said. The 4001st glyph was burning in her chest, responding to Aria's distant weaving. "She's almost finished. I can feel it." "Almost isn't good enough. We need..." A new voice cut through the chaos. "Need what? Reinforcements?" Everyone turned. On the horizon, flames were rising, not the flames of destruction, but the flames of creation. The fire that could write stories into being. And at the head of the flames walked a figure pale as ash, marked with spiraling runes, smiling a smile that was not cruel and not kind but something in between. Serathor Veltharn, the Prince of Ashes, had arrived. "I hear you need an army," he said. "I brought one." Behind him, the Ember Fleet descended from the sky, ships of molten glass and crystallized flame, crewed by the Ash Guard and commanded by Ashen Veltharn herself. The Ember Matron stood at the prow of the lead ship, her ancient eyes blazing with the fire of 3,000 years. "The House of Veltharn answers the call," Ashen declared. "The Prince of Ashes walks again. And the Severed will learn what it means to face the flame that writes stories into being." Serathor raised his hand. Flames spiraled around his fingers. "Let's see if 3,000 years of imprisonment have made me rusty." He plunged into the battle, and the Severed began to burn. Chapter 10: The Prince of Ashes and the Child of Continuation. The battle turned. With Serathor and the Ember Fleet reinforcing the allied army, the Severed's advance slowed. The Prince of Ashes fought with a ferocity that was terrifying and beautiful, his flames writing new stories into existence even as the Severed tried to unmake the old ones. Every thread they unraveled, he rewove. Every story they erased, he rewrote. But even Serathor could not hold them forever. "There are too many," he said, falling back to where Uchelon and Dominic were holding the line. "The Severed are infinite. They are the threads of the perfect framework, and the perfect framework has no end." "Then we need to complete the seal," Uchelon said. "The child is still weaving. I can feel her." Serathor looked toward the World Tree, where Aria sat in the garden drawing maps of impossible complexity. "She's almost finished. But the final thread, the one that will bind the seal, it has to be placed at the center of the Severed's power. The first spindle. The one in the Obsidian Wastes. That's behind enemy lines," Dominic said. "Yes. Someone has to go. Someone the Severed won't see coming." "Who?" Serathor smiled, that ambiguous smile, cruel and kind and something in between. "The Prince of Ashes has been a villain for 3,000 years. Maybe it's time he tried being something else." He turned toward the heart of the Severed army, flames spiraling around him. "Tell the little mapmaker to have that seal ready. I'll clear the path." "Serathor," Ashen began. "I know what I am, descendant. I know what I've done. The UR tale. The fracture wars. The betrayal. 3,000 years of imprisonment, and I've had time to think about all of it." He looked back at her, and for a moment, his smile was almost gentle. Maybe the prophecy was right. Maybe the Prince of Ashes and the Child of Continuation will either save existence or burn it to ash. But I think I'd like to try saving it first. He walked into the heart of the Severed army, and the flames rose around him like a funeral pyre. Chapter 11: The Weaving Complete. Aria sat in the garden of the Provisional Congress and traced the final thread. She had been weaving for hours, maybe days. She was too young to understand time the way adults did, and the seal was almost complete. It was not a wall, like the old seals. It was not a prison, like the one that had held the Severed. It was a door. A choice. The same choice that had been offered to Uchelon. The same choice that had been offered to the spirits of conclusion. The same choice that was offered to every story in the new framework. Transform. Continue. Or be left behind. Almost, the weaver said. Its form was nearly gone now, just a few threads remaining. The final connection. The one that binds the seal to the Severed. It must be placed at the first spindle. "I know," Aria said. She was 2.5 years old, but she spoke with the clarity of someone who had seen the threads of existence since before she was born. "The Prince of Ashes is there. He's making a path." "A path for who?" Lendra asked. "Me." "No. Absolutely not. You're not going into the middle of a battle. Mommy, Aria said, and it was the first time she had ever used that word. I have to. The threads are ready. The seal is ready. But I have to place the last thread. Only I can see it. Only I can weave it. Lendra looked at Darren. Darren looked at Lendra. Something passed between them, the same communication that had passed between them at the first page, when they had let their daughter walk into the source of all narrative. We're coming with you, Darren said. Of course you are, Aria said, and smiled. Chapter 12, The Heart of the Severed. The first spindle rose from the Obsidian Wastes like a needle thrust into the heart of existence. Around it, the severed were thickest, their spiraling forms woven together into a mass of unraveling threads that pulse with the light of the perfect framework. At its base, Serathor Veltharn stood alone, his flames burning against the tide of unmaking. You came, he said as Darren, Lendra, and Aria approached through the chaos. You made a path, Darren said. I say I would. Serathor looked at Aria. You're the mapmaker's daughter. The child of continuation. The one who completed the cycle. And you're the Prince of Ashes. The one who tried to seize the Uatale. The one who was sealed for 3,000 years. Yes. Do you know what I learned in those 3,000 years? What? That endings are not the same as conclusions. That imprisonment is not the same as transformation. That a prince who wanted to control everything was really just afraid of being controlled himself. He knelt before her, a gesture of respect that no one who knew the old Serathor would have believed possible. I was a villain. I'm trying to be something else. Will you let me help you? Aria looked at him for a long moment. Her small face was unreadable, the face of a child who saw the connections between all things, including the threads that bound the Prince of Ashes to his past and his future. Yes, she said. You're not a villain anymore. You're a door. Serathor laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised and warm. A door. I've been called many things, but never that. Open, Aria said. Close. Open again. Continue. She turned toward the spindle and began to weave. The severed swarmed toward her, their thread-woven limbs reaching out to unmake the child who threatened their purpose. But Serathor's flames held them back, and Darren's map blazed with protective light, and Lendra's empathic waves pushed against the tide of unmaking with all the force of a mother's love. And Aria placed the final thread. The seal blazed into existence, not a wall, but a door. Not a prison, but a choice. The severed felt it wrap around them, and they screamed, not in pain, but in confusion. The perfect framework they had sought to restore was being replaced by something else. Something that offered them transformation instead of purification. Choose, Aria said, and her voice was the voice of the cycle completed. Continue. Or be left behind. The severed hesitated. Some of them, the ones who had been forced into the seal, who had never wanted to unmake the world, who had only wanted to protect the perfect framework, chose continuation. Their spiraling forms unwound and rewove themselves into new shapes, becoming doors instead of walls, becoming threads in the new framework instead of unmaking the old one. But others refused. They clung to their purpose, to their hatred of the fractured world, to their belief that mortals were corruptions that must be erased. And those severed were left behind. The seal closed around them, not destroying them but containing them, a door that they could open whenever they chose, if they ever chose to transform. It's done, Aria said. The cycle is complete. The door is open. The world continues. She collapsed into her father's arms, exhausted. Epilogue: The Prince Reborn. 3 months later, Darren stood in the garden of the Provisional Congress and watched his daughter draw maps in the dirt. She was almost 3 years old now, walking, talking, exploring the world with the fierce curiosity of a child who had woven the fate of existence before she could write her own name. Her maps were more complex than ever, showing connections that spanned the entire fractured world and beyond. "She's still doing it," Landra said, settling onto the bench beside him. "She'll always be doing it. It's who she is." "I know. But look, she's drawing something new." Darren looked. Aria was not just tracing connections between existing stories. She was drawing a figure, a tall man with pale skin and spiraling runes, flames dancing around his fingers. And beside him, another figure, a woman in armor of molten glass, her crown of burning bronze hovering above her head. "Serathor and Evangeline," Darren said. "She's drawing their future." "What future is that?" "I don't know. But I think it involves fire." In the city of Aethoria, Serathor Veltharn stood before the Phoenix seat and looked out at the city he had left behind 3,000 years ago. It was different now, transformed by time and the new framework, its amber spires reaching toward a sky that no longer threatened to collapse. "The severed are contained," Evangeline said, standing at his side. "The cycle is complete. The world is saved. What will you do now?" Serathor looked at his hands, the hands that had once tried to seize the Uatale, the hands that had burned with the fire of creation and destruction, the hands that had been sealed for 3,000 years. "I don't know," he said. "I've been a villain for so long. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." "Then learn. The same way Uchelon learned. The same way the spirits of conclusion learned. The same way we're all learning. Learn to be a door instead of a wall. Learn to be whatever you choose to be. That's the point of the new framework. Choice. Transformation. Continuation." Serathor smiled, that ambiguous smile, cruel and kind and something in between. But now, perhaps, it was leaning more toward kind. "Then I choose to be something new," he said. "Something the Prince of Ashes never was." "What's that?" "A storyteller." Epilogue Part 2, The Weaver's Farewell. In the depths of the library of the third stories, the last threads of the Weaver were finally unraveling. It had held on long enough to see the seal completed, the severed contained, the cycle truly finished. Now it was fading, its consciousness dissolving into the threads it had woven so long ago. "Thank you," Uchelon said. He sat on his coral throne, surrounded by the spirits of his school, watching the Weaver's final moments. "For everything. For sealing the severed. For helping the child. For giving us a chance." "The chance was always yours," the Weaver said. "I merely helped it along." The first storyteller believed that mortals could create stories greater than any god or spirit. I believed it too. And you proved us right. What will happen to you now? I will become threads. The same threads I was woven from, before the first story was written. I will return to the framework and become part of the cycle. Not an ending. A transformation. "A door," Uchelon said. "Yes. A door." The Weaver's spiraling face turned toward him one last time. "Take care of them, Uchelon. The mortals. The spirits. The stories. They are more precious than you know." "I know. I've been practicing." The Weaver laughed, a sound like threads being woven into a new pattern. "Yes. You have." And then it was gone, dissolving into 1,000 threads of light that spread through the library, through the depths, through the entire framework of existence. The last of the Threadborn had returned to the fabric of reality. And somewhere in the garden of the Provisional Congress, Aria looked up from her maps and smiled. "Goodbye," she said. "Hello." Continue. Prologue, the page that waited. In the stillness between heartbeats, between stories, between the breath of the world and its echo, a page lay waiting. It was not the first page, that vast, unformed whiteness at the source of all narrative. It was not the tale, that ancient manuscript now completed, its pages finally at peace. It was something smaller. Something personal. A single sheet of parchment, unmarked, unfurled on a desk of charred cedar in a chamber that had been sealed for 3,000 years. The chamber belonged to Serathor Veltharn. Before his imprisonment. Before his betrayal. Before the fracture wars and the sealing of the severed and the long, slow centuries of silence beneath the Obsidian Wastes. Before any of it, Serathor had been something else. Something that history had forgotten. A writer. The page had waited all this time. The inkwell beside it had dried to dust. The quill had crumbled to ash. But the page itself remained, preserved by the same flame that had once burned in the Prince of Ashes' heart, the flame that wrote stories into being. Now, 3 months after the Battle of the Obsidian Edge, Serathor returned to that chamber. He had been a villain, a traitor, a prisoner. He had been a weapon against the severed. He had been offered a second chance. And he had decided to become a storyteller. He sat at the desk. He looked at the empty page. And for the first time in 3,000 years, he picked up a pen. Once, he began, there was a prince who burned the world. And then he tried to write it back. The page began to glow. Chapter 1, the first lesson. The school of Uchelon had grown in the months since the Severed's containment. What had started as a dozen spirits gathered around a god's throne had become a community of nearly 300. Former endings, unwritten who had found their voices, whisperfolk who had come to learn from the being who had once been the end of all things. The library of the third story was no longer just a library, it was a sanctuary. A place where stories that had been lost could be found, where narratives that had been broken could be mended, where beings who had never known purpose could discover who they wanted to become. And today, it had a new student. Serathor Veltharn walked through the coral archways of the library, his flames dimmed to a gentle glow. The spirits parted before him, recognizing him from the battle, from the stories that had already begun to spread through the narrative field. The Prince of Ashes. The traitor who had tried to seize the tale. The champion who had held the line against the severed. The man who was trying to become something new. "You came," Uchelon said. He sat on his throne of living coral, the map on his chest pulsing with the light of Darren's story. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Serathor admitted. "But I made a promise. To the child. To myself. I said I would learn to be a storyteller. And you came to me." "I am not a storyteller. I am a former ending. I write, yes, but I am still learning what it means to create. That's why I came. I've spent 3,000 years as a villain. I know how to destroy things. I know how to burn things. I know how to break the world and remake it in my image. But I don't know how to write a story that doesn't end in fire." Uchelon regarded him for a long moment. The god who had learned to weep, who had learned to smile, who had learned to connect, saw something in the Prince of Ashes that he recognized. The terror of transformation. The weight of a past that could not be erased. The fragile hope of becoming something other than what you had always been. Then let us learn together, Uchelon said. The first lesson of storytelling is this: you cannot write a new story until you accept the old one. Not erase it. Not forget it. Accept it. The prince who burned the world is part of who you are. He will always be part of who you are. The question is not how to erase him. The question is how to make him part of a larger narrative. And if the larger narrative is still about fire, then let it be about fire. But fire can destroy, and fire can warm. Fire can end, and fire can begin. The flames that burn the world are the same flames that held back the severed. The question is not what the fire is. The question is what you choose to do with it. Serathor looked down at his hands. The spiraling runes that marked his skin pulsed with a light that was neither cruel nor kind, but something in between. The light of a prince who had been a villain and was trying to become something else. I want to write a story about a prince who burned the world, he said. And then spend the rest of his life trying to heal it. Then write it. Not as a monument to your guilt. As a gift to the world you almost destroyed. Serathor picked up his pen. The page before him was blank, but it would not be blank for long. Chapter 2: The Emissary's Second Word. In a small room in the Provisional Congress, the gaunt woman with ice-cheap eyes sat at her desk and tried to write her second word. She had written her first word months ago, once, and it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. She had been a reclaimer, an agent of the cult that sought to restore the Uatale by erasing the fractured world. She had been an enemy of everything the Congress stood for. She had tried to unmake existence itself. And then she had been offered a choice. She had taken the Whisper Folk's hand. She had accepted that the Uatale was not meant to be restored, but completed. She had begun to learn what it meant to be something other than a destroyer. But the second word was harder than the first. Once is easy, she said to the empty room. Once is a beginning. Anything can follow once. But the second word commits you. The second word determines what kind of story you're telling. She had been sitting at her desk for hours, the pen trembling in her hand, the blank page stretching before her like an accusation. She had written once at the top of the page. Beneath it, there was nothing. You're still struggling. She looked up. Lyra Dracoi stood in the doorway, as she had so many times before. The former princess, the former reclaimer ally, the woman who had refused to help unmake the world. I don't know what comes next, the emissary admitted. I was a destroyer. Everything I wrote before was orders. Plans. Strategies for unmaking. I don't know how to write anything else. Then start with something true. Something you've never said before. The emissary looked at the page. Something true. Something she had never said before. Her hand moved. She wrote the second word. Once, I. She paused. The third word was already forming, but she was afraid to write it. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of the story it would commit her to. I what? Lyra asked gently. The emissary's ice-cheap eyes filled with tears. Once, I believed. Once, I believed that the fractured world was a mistake. Once, I believed that the Uatale should be restored. Once, I believed that everyone I was trying to erase, everyone in this Congress, everyone in the Shadow Draft, everyone who had ever told a story that wasn't the original, deserved to be unwritten. She took a shuddering breath. That's what I believed. That's who I was. And I don't know how to write the next sentence because I don't know who I am now. Lyra crossed the room and sat beside her. Then write that. Write that you don't know. Write that you're still figuring it out. Write that the person who believed those things is gone, and the person who sits here now is someone else. Someone who is trying to be better. That's not a story. It's the beginning of one. The emissary looked at the page. She picked up her pen. And she wrote the third word. Once, I believed that the world should be unmade. But now. She paused. The fourth word came to her, and this time she did not hesitate. Now I am learning to make something instead. She set down the pen. The sentence was incomplete, the story barely begun. But it was a start. It was a second word, a third word, a fourth word. It was continuation. Thank you, she said to Lyra. For what? For not giving up on me. For coming back, again and again. For believing I could change. I didn't believe you could change, Lyra said honestly. I hoped you could. There's a difference. And now? Lyra smiled. Now I believe it too. Chapter 3, The Sea Dream Remembers. In the drowned halls of Tidelocked Hall, Aethoria Vehlon, once called the Sea Dreamed, sat before the dreaming pool and watched visions of the past and future ripple across its surface. The pool showed her many things. The completion of the cycle. The containment of the severed. The Prince of Ashes learning to write. The emissary writing her second word. The child of continuation drawing maps in the dirt of a garden that had become the center of a new kind of world. But the pool also showed her something else. Something she had not expected to see. A ship. It sailed on an ocean that did not exist in any draft, a sea of pure narrative potential, where waves were made of unwritten stories and the wind was the breath of unborn possibilities. The ship was carved from Leviathan bone, its sails spun from moon silk. It was a Vehlon vessel, but it was not part of her fleet. It was older. Much older. And at its helm stood a figure she recognized from the oldest stories her people told. The Leviathan envoy. The first of her line. The ancestor who had sailed the seas before the fracture, before the tale, before the first storyteller put pen to page. The one who had made a pact with the ancient things that live in the deep, the things that were not gods, not spirits, not stories, but something else entirely. The deep ones, Aethoria breathed. Their stirring. The Leviathan envoy turned its ancient face toward her, a face that was not a face, but a pattern of bioluminescent scars that spelled out words in a language that predated language. And it spoke. The cycle is complete. The door is open. The old pact must be renewed, or broken. What pact? What are you talking about? Before the tale was written, before the Threadborn wove the framework, we made a pact with the deep ones. They would stay in the abyss, beyond the reach of stories. They would not interfere with the narratives mortals told. In exchange, we would never sail beyond the margins. We would never seek them out. The pact held for uncountable millennia. But now the cycle is complete. The door is open. Yes. And the deep ones are curious. They want to know what has become of the world they left behind. They want to know if the stories mortals tell are worthy of their attention. And if they decide they're not. The Leviathan envoy was silent for a long moment. Then the pact is broken. And the deep ones will rise. Aethoria felt her ancient heart stir with a fear she had not felt since the fracture. The deep ones were not like the severed. They were not like Uchelon. They were not like anything the fractured world had ever faced. They were older than the framework. older than narrative itself. They were the things that had existed in the silence before the first word was spoken. And they were waking up. Chapter 4: The Mapmaker's Warning. Aria was 3 years old when she drew her first map of the deep. She had been drawing maps since before she could walk, maps of connections, maps of stories, maps of the threads that bound all narratives together. But this map was different. This map showed a place that did not exist in any story. A place that was not part of the framework. A place that was outside. "Mommy," she said, tugging at Landra's sleeve. "Look." Landra looked. The map was drawn in the dirt of the garden, as all of Aria's maps were, but this one was unlike any she had seen before. It showed the familiar features of the fractured world, the prime draft, the shadow draft, the margins between, the world tree with its tree trunks. But at the edges of the map, beyond the margins, beyond even the unwritten expanse, Aria had drawn something new. A void. An absence. A place where the lines of connection simply stopped. And within that void, shapes. Shapes that were not quite shapes. Presences that were not quite presences. Things that watched and waited and hungered. "What are those?" Landra asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "The deep ones," Aria said. "They're waking up." The cycle completed. The door opened. They heard it. Heard what? The story. All the stories. The first story, the second story, the third story. They heard them being told. And now they want to know who's telling them. The Ren arrived, summoned by the pulse of his map, which had begun to blaze with an intensity he had never felt before. He looked at Aria's drawing and felt his blood run cold. "The deep ones," he said. "The Whisperfolk told us about them. The things that existed before the framework. Before the UR tale. Before any of it. They're not evil," Aria said. "They're not good. They're not stories at all. They're the silence between the words. The space between the threads. They've always been there. But they were sleeping. Now they're waking up." "Why now?" "Because the cycle is complete. The first story, the second story, the third stories, they were all told. The framework is whole. And the deep ones, they're curious. They want to see what we've made. And if they don't like what they see..." Aria looked up at her father with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and for the first time, the Ren saw something in her expression that he had never seen before. Fear. Then they'll unmake it. Not like the Severed. The Severed wanted to restore the perfect framework. The deep ones, they don't care about the framework. They don't care about stories at all. If they decide we're not worthy of the narratives we've told, they'll return everything to silence. The silence that existed before the first word. The silence that will exist after the last. Can we stop them? I don't know. They're not part of the framework. They're outside it. The threads don't reach them. The maps don't show them, except this one. She pointed at her drawing. I can see them. I don't know why. But I can see them. Then we need to tell the others. The Congress. Uchelon. Serathor. Everyone. Yes, Aria said. But first. She reached down and added something to the map. A single line, extending from the world tree into the void. A thread of connection where no connection should be possible. First I need to talk to them. Chapter 5, The Voice from the Void. That night, Aria sat alone in the garden beneath the world tree's tree trunks and listened to the silence. She had told her parents she needed to be alone, that the deep ones would not speak if there were others present. The Wren had protested, Landra had argued, but Aria had been insistent in the way only a 3-year-old who had woven the fate of existence could be. "I'll be safe," she said. "They're not here to hurt me. They're here to ask a question." "What question?" "I don't know yet. But I'll find out." Now, in the silver light of the twin moons, Aria closed her eyes and reached out with the perception that had been hers since before she was born. She traced the threads of connection that bound all stories together, the Ua tale, the second story, the third story, the infinite narratives that branch from them. And then she pushed beyond them, into the spaces where no threads reached, into the void where the deep ones waited. "Hello," she said, not with her voice but with her presence. The void was silent for a long moment. Then, "Hello, little mapmaker. We have been watching you." "I know. I felt you watching. You are the child of continuation. The one who completed the cycle. The one who weaves connections where none existed before. You are interesting. That's what everyone says. But you're not like everyone. You're not part of the framework. No. We are outside. We have always been outside. We were here before the first word was spoken. We will be here after the last word fades. We are the silence between the stories. The space between the threads. The void that surrounds all things. Why are you waking up? Because the cycle is complete. The first story, the second story, the third stories, they were all told. The framework is whole. And we are curious. We want to know if the stories you tell are worthy of the silence we gave up to make room for them. And if they're not, the void pulsed with something that might have been amusement or might have been hunger, Aria could not tell which. Then we take the silence back. We unmake the framework. We return everything to the void that existed before the first word was spoken. That's not fair. You can't judge us by standards we don't understand. You're not part of the framework. You don't know what it means to be a story. Perhaps. But we are the only judges that matter. The framework exists within our silence. It always has. When the first storyteller spoke the first word, they borrowed the silence we lent them. Now the debt must be repaid, or renewed. Renewed how? Someone must speak to us. Not with words. Not with stories. With presence. Someone must come to the edge of the void and show us what the framework has become. Show us the stories you have told. Show us the connections you have woven. And convince us that the silence we gave up was worth the sacrifice. And if no one can, then the debt is not renewed. And the framework returns to silence. Aria opened her eyes. The garden was quiet. The world tree whispered with the voices of 1,000 stories. The void was still there, at the edges of her perception, watching and waiting. She stood up and went to find her parents. "I know what we have to do," she said. "Someone has to go to the deep ones. Someone has to speak for the framework." "Who?" the Wren asked. "Not just one person. A delegation. Representatives of everything the framework has become. Mortals, spirits, former endings, unwritten, Threadborn, or what's left of them. The Prince of Ashes. The Whisper Folk. Uchelon. Everyone who has a stake in the stories we've told. And if they're not convinced?" Aria looked at her father, and her eyes were ancient and young at the same time. Then we make new stories. Stories that even the deep ones can't ignore. Chapter 6. The delegation assembles. They gathered at the edge of the unwritten expanse, where the threads of the framework frayed into the void beyond. Aria had chosen the location carefully. It was the closest point to the deep one's domain, a place where the silence between stories was so thick it could be felt like a pressure against the skin. The Whisperfolk called it the threshold. The unwritten called it the edge. Uchelon, who had spent 10,000 years in the darkness, called it something else. Home, he said, standing at the boundary between existence and void. Or something like it. I was not in the deep one's domain, I was in the abyss, which is part of the framework. But I was close. I could feel them, even then. The silence beyond the silence. The void beyond the void. Did they ever speak to you? Serathor asked. The Prince of Ashes had come, his flames dimmed to embers, his pen tucked behind his ear like a scribe. No. I was not interesting enough. I was an ending, and endings are part of the framework. The deep ones have no interest in endings. They have no interest in stories at all. That's the problem. Then how do we convince them? I don't know. But the child has a plan. Aria stood at the center of the delegation, her small form dwarfed by the towering presences around her. Derain and Landra flanked her, their hands on her shoulders. Behind them stood the representatives of everything the fractured world had become. Seraphina, the glyph of consent blazing in her chest. Caris, the black flame burning gently on his fingertip. The Echo Queen, her blind eyes seeing futures that even the deep ones might not be able to perceive. Helena and Arthur, the anchor, and the warden, their bond unbreakable. Dominic and Damien, warriors who had faced endings and chosen continuation. Kaelin and Lyra, the poet and the former princess, who had learned to argue instead of control. Jasmine and Choros, the Mantica's corrosive aura subdued but watchful. She who heard the first silence, representing the Whisperfolk and their ancient memory. The first written, now fully solid, representing the unwritten who had found their voices. The tragedy of the hero's death, representing the spirits of conclusion who had chosen transformation. The emissary with ice cheap ice, representing the reclaimers who had learned to write instead of erase. Evangeline Veltharn, Duchess of Ash, representing the house that had waited 3,000 years for its prince to return. And Serathor himself, the Prince of Ashes, representing the villains who were trying to become something else. And Uchelon, the god who had been the ending of all things, now representing the continuation that had transformed him. "We're ready," Aria said. "The deep ones are waiting. They want to see what the framework has become. So let's show them." She stepped forward, across the threshold, into the void. And one by one, the delegation followed. Chapter 7. The Court of Silence. The void was not a place. It was an absence of place. A negation of presence. A silence so profound that even thoughts seemed to falter within it. The delegation moved through it like figures in a dream, their forms flickering at the edges, their stories threatening to unravel. But at the center of the void, something waited. The deep ones. They were not beings in any sense the delegation could understand. They were presences that were also absences. Shapes that were also voids. Voices that were also silences. They surrounded the delegation like an ocean surrounding a droplet of ink, vast, patient, utterly alien. "You have come," the deep ones said. Their voice was not a voice. It was the space between words, the pause between breaths, the silence at the end of a story that has not yet begun. "We have come," Aria said. You asked to see what the framework has become. We're here to show you. Show us, then. Convince us that the stories you tell are worthy of the silence we gave up. Aria looked at the delegation. One by one, they stepped forward. Uchelon spoke first. I was the ending of all things. For 10,000 years, I consumed stories. I brought them to their final page. I was silence, not the silence you are, but a silence of completion. And then a mortal gave me a story of his own. A story of love and fear and hope and despair. A story of connection. And I learned to weep. And I learned to smile. And I learned to continue. The dead ones listened. Seraphina spoke next. I carried a glyph of consent. The voice that says yes when everything else says no. The fractured world was born from conflict, from the split between drafts, from the logic of ending. But we chose to transform. We chose to continue. We chose to write new stories instead of unmaking old ones. The dead ones listened. Serathor spoke. I was a villain. I tried to seize the UR tail. I tried to control everything because I was afraid of being controlled. I was sealed for 3,000 years, and in that time, I learned that imprisonment is not the same as transformation. I am still learning. I am still becoming. I am writing a story about a prince who burned the world and is trying to heal it. The dead ones listened. One by one, they all spoke. The whisper folk sang the songs of the first story. The unwritten whispered the narratives they were learning to tell. The emissary read the single sentence she had written. Once, I believed the world should be unmade, but now I am learning to make something instead. Even the Echo Queen shared a vision of a future where the framework continued, branching into infinite possibilities, none of them ending, all of them transforming. And then Aria stepped forward one final time. You asked if the stories we tell are worthy of the silence you gave up, she said. I don't know the answer. I'm 3 years old. I've only just started to understand what stories are. But I know this, the silence you gave up wasn't wasted. It made room for something. Something that didn't exist before. Something that could not exist without the space you created. She traced a line in the void, a thread of golden light, the same light she used to draw maps of connection. The framework is not perfect. It fractures. It breaks. It has to be mended and remade and transformed. But that's what makes it beautiful. That's what makes it alive. Perfection is silence. Perfection is the void before the first word. But stories are messy. Stories are broken. Stories are full of contradictions and emotions and things that don't make logical sense. And that's why they matter. She drew another thread, and another, weaving them together into a pattern that spanned the void. You asked us to convince you. I can't. I can only show you what we've made. The rest is your choice. The dead ones were silent for a long, long moment. Then, you have shown us something we did not expect, little mapmaker. Not perfection. Not completion. Not the flawless framework the Threadborn tried to create. You have shown us continuation. The willingness to keep going even when the outcome is uncertain. The courage to transform even when transformation is painful. The choice to be something other than what you were. This is not what we anticipated. This is interesting. We will not unmake the framework. Not yet. The debt is renewed. But it is not permanent. We will watch. We will wait. And one day, we will ask again, are the stories you tell worthy of the silence we gave up? When that day comes, Be ready to answer. The void receded. The delegation found themselves back on the threshold, the unwritten expanse stretching before them, the world tree glowing in the distance. They had succeeded. For now. Chapter 8, The Prince's First Story. 3 months later, Serathor Veltharn finished his first story. He sat in the library of the third story, surrounded by the spirits of Uchelon's school, and read it aloud. It was a story about a prince who burned the world, a prince who was arrogant and afraid, who tried to control everything because he could not control himself, who was sealed away for 3,000 years and emerged into a world that had moved on without him. But it was also a story about a prince who learned to write. A prince who sat at the feet of a god who had once been the ending of all things and learned that creation was harder than destruction, but infinitely more rewarding. A prince who walked into the void beyond existence and spoke on behalf of the framework he had once tried to seize. A prince who was trying to become something new. When he finished, the spirits applauded, a strange sound, like pages turning and doors opening and stories beginning. Uchelon smiled his practiced smile, which had become almost natural. It is a good story, the god said. Not perfect. Perfection is silence. But it is alive. It breathes. It continues. Will it be enough? Serathor asked. When the deep ones ask again, will our stories be worthy? I don't know. But that's not the point. The point is that we keep telling them. We keep writing them. We keep transforming. Serathor looked at the completed manuscript in his hands. 3,000 years of imprisonment, a few months of freedom, and this was what he had to show for it. A single story, imperfect and unfinished, about a prince who was still learning who he was. It was enough. Thank you, he said to Uchelon, for teaching me. I taught you nothing. I merely reminded you of what you already knew. The first storyteller was mortal. Every storyteller since has been mortal. You are mortal. Creation is your birthright. You just forgot. I forgot a lot of things. I'm remembering. Good. Keep remembering. Keep writing. The deep ones are watching. The child is watching. The world is watching. Serathor smiled, that ambiguous smile, cruel and kind and something in between, but now leaning more toward kind. Then I'd better write something worth reading. He picked up his pen and began the second story. Epilogue, the quiet before. The Wren stood in the garden of the Provisional Congress and watched his daughter draw maps in the dirt. She was 3.5 years old now. Her maps were more complex than ever, showing connections that span not just the fractured world but the void beyond. She had drawn the deep ones in the margins of her cartography, not as threats, but as presences. Watchers. Judges who were not enemies, but not allies either. Will they come back? The Wren asked. Yes, Aria said. One day. When they're ready. When we're ready. Will we be ready? Aria looked up at her father with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. I don't know. But we'll keep telling stories. We'll keep weaving connections. We'll keep continuing. And when they come back, she smiled, we'll have new stories to show them. The Wren put his arm around his daughter. The map on his forearm pulsed with a gentle light, the light of connections that could never be fully mapped, stories that could never be fully told, continuations that could never be fully completed. Then let's make them good ones, he said. Map, Aria agreed. Continue. Together. End of special episode, The Ashen Pen.